and take her to the hospital. Those are the kind of moments that you just never forget.
I actually said, Joe, our lives have changed forever.
I thought she was a goner. I was going to lose her. On one occasion, they had to stick her over 30 times to get one IV line in her.
And he just turned to me. He said, I really can't see.
I couldn't ignore it anymore.
Next, 3 medical mysteries that defied the experts. 5-year-old twins Alexis and Noah Beery have struggled all their lives with a mysterious array of symptoms. But as their parents Joe and Retta look on, they suddenly begin to deteriorate, and no doctor can tell them why.
I expected the doctors to have an answer, and there wasn't an answer for a long, long time.
Then, Jake and Brenda Kalmalot are overjoyed when their first child, Isabel, is born. But joy quickly turns to fear as Isabel goes from the nursery to the intensive care unit within the first week of her life.
Making the diagnosis soon was the most critical point. Even hours matter in these patients.
And Pastor Charlie Harper is a pillar of his community until a mysterious symptom turns this once outgoing man into a virtual shut-in.
It was scary. I didn't believe that I could ask other people for help.
We look at the doctors for what they can't. If diagnosis is a mystery.
In 1996, Retta Beery discovers she's pregnant for a second time. Retta and her husband Joe already have a 2-year-old son named Zach and are thrilled to learn they're having twins. On December 16th, Noah and Alexis are born.
When I first saw Noah and Alexis, I was overjoyed. I was thankful they were healthy.
I held Noah first and then Alexis, and it was just a great feeling.
Retta and the seemingly healthy twins are discharged from the hospital the very next day.
Everything was just picture perfect. And then we brought Noah and Alexis home. Life changed from that moment on. They cried nonstop that whole first night.
The twins don't stop crying the next day or the day after that.
Crying was horrible. At night they'd cry, in the morning, and in the afternoon.
After weeks of relentless crying, Retta takes the twins to the pediatrician where they are diagnosed with colic, a condition in which an otherwise healthy baby cries or screams for extended periods without any discernible reason.
Their pediatrician told me initially that colic could last for about 3 to 6 months. And as we hit the 6-month mark, she told me in rare cases it could last 9 to 12 months.
1997, I will always remember as probably one of the worst years because for the most part, Retta or I were up and awake 24 hours a day.
On top of the nonstop crying, the Beerys noticed that the twins are also having trouble keeping down food.
Noah and Alexis were both throwing up about 3 to 6 times a day.
When they threw up, especially in Noah's case, it wasn't just the little spit up that you would get from a normal infant. His whole stomach would empty.
Since the twins seem to be gaining weight and appear otherwise healthy, the doctor tells the Beerys not to worry. But at 9 months, they still haven't slept through a night and are throwing up virtually all their food. The doctors still can't explain it, but by then, the pediatrician has become more concerned with another alarming symptom.
At 9 months, a typical child should be able to crawl and sit up. Noah and Alexis were not rolling over. They were not able to lift themselves up with their arms. They were certainly not crawling.
Baffled, the Beerys' pediatrician refers them to a pediatric neurologist.
The first time the neurologist saw the twins, he called them floppy. He definitely agreed that there was something wrong.
The neurologist orders an immediate MRI, but the scan requires absolute stillness, so he decides to perform it only on Alexis, since she seems to be more floppy than Noah.
When we got the MRI results back, it showed that there was no concern.
But only a few days later, something happens to Alexis that absolutely terrifies her parents.
It was a Saturday morning. We were in the living room, we were playing, and I looked at her and I could tell something was wrong.
Joe came running in with Alexis, and he told me that she had just had a seizure. We called 911.
It was really hard because I had to carry her to the ambulance and put her in the ambulance and take her to the hospital. Those are the kind of moments that you just never forget.
At the hospital, an emergency CAT scan of Alexis's brain comes back normal, which isn't uncommon with seizures.
The neurologists were still at this point uncertain as to a diagnosis for Alexis, but they started her on seizure medication.
We were very, very concerned. It was then that we really started looking for an answer that the doctors weren't giving us.
Diagnosis is a mystery.
Alexis and Noah Beery are approaching 2 years old, and their doctors still have no idea what's causing their myriad symptoms, including seizures, vomiting, and weak motor skills. Though both have been sickly, the twins have more or less developed the same. But suddenly, all that begins to change.
At 2 years, you could clearly see the difference between Noah and Alexis. Although Noah still threw up all the time, he was walking and he looked like a typical child, whereas Alexis was definitely not. Her arms were curled up in front of her, her eyes would roll up into the top of her head, and she could still never sleep through the night. When you saw her, you would look at her and say, that's definitely a little girl with problems.
The Beerys decide to go back to square one. And a new set of MRIs is ordered, this time on both twins. Just like the last time, Alexis's comes back normal. But when they look at Noah's, they can't believe what they're seeing.
It showed brain damage in his ventricle area.
It's basically spots around the ventricles of the brain, which is common in children of multiple births.
Sometimes, with multiple births, one or both of the fetuses doesn't get enough blood flow to the brain, causing the nerve fiber around the cerebrospinal fluid-filled ventricles to die. This condition is a form of cerebral palsy, a catch-all term referring to brain damage that affects movement and muscle control.
They basically associated Noah's diagnosis with Alexis and labeled them both with cerebral palsy. It was a relief to a degree because now we had something to grab onto that would allow us to go off and work with it. The mystery was gone.
And there's good news that comes with the diagnosis. The neurologist assures the Beerys that cerebral palsy is a non-degenerative condition and that with intense physical therapy, the twins will make tremendous progress.
We knew that cerebral palsy wouldn't get worse, so they could only get better.
Over the next 2.5 years, life for the Beerys revolves around the twins' physical therapy and doctor's appointments.
We kind of moved into a world of our own in which we had to manage our lives differently.
Initially, it looks as though the therapy is working, for Noah at least.
Noah was improving. He was still drooling, and he was still throwing up every day of his life. But by the time he was 4 years old, Noah looked pretty much like a typical child. You wouldn't know anything physically was wrong with him.
But for Alexis, the therapy doesn't seem to be nearly as effective.
Alexis was struggling to walk. She would fall down a lot. She wore a helmet to protect her head. She was still very floppy. Her eyes would roll back up in her head and she couldn't bring them down. She never slept through the night.
And soon, Retta and Joe begin to notice another strange behavior in Alexis.
When Alexis would wake up in the morning, she was able to function at a much higher level, but by 10:30 or 11 o'clock in the morning, she simply could not function.
Then, when the twins are nearly 5 years old, all the Beerys' hopes for Alexis are shattered.
Alexis just kind of regressed and went backwards. And it was scary seeing her get worse.
She seemed to be losing more and more of her ability to walk.
Cerebral palsy's not supposed to get worse, and she was clearly getting worse.
For the first time in 2.5 years, Retta begins to question the cerebral palsy diagnosis.
I came across an article that talks about the disorder that is often misdiagnosed as cerebral palsy, but it's treatable with a medication. And one of the common threads in this other disorder that separates it from cerebral palsy is how the patients function at a higher level in the morning or after sleep, and as the day goes on, they become more debilitated.
I was laying on the bed reading, and Retta walked up to the side of the bed with a piece of paper, and she was almost crying. And I said, "What's wrong?" And she handed me this piece of paper, and I read the article, and it still gets to me today because the article could have been written about Alexis.
If diagnosis is a mystery.
For the past 5 years, twins Alexis and Noah Beery have been suffering from severe motor delays and a host of other symptoms that have been attributed to cerebral palsy. But one night, their parents, Joe and Retta Beery, come across an article about a treatable disease that mimics cerebral palsy. The symptoms sound almost identical to those that the twins have been experiencing.
The very idea that Noah and Alexis had something that was treatable was beyond anything that we had ever hoped for or dreamed of.
Retta immediately emails Dr. John Fink, the neurologist mentioned in the article. The next morning, they're surprised to find there's already a reply waiting in their inbox.
He and I went back and forth with emails. I asked him, is there any way that you can see Alexis? And about 5 or 6 more emails into it, he asked if we could bring Noah and Alexis out to Michigan. And I said, absolutely.
The Beerys are full of hope as they board the plane to Ann Arbor, Michigan to meet Dr. Fink.
I was initially skeptical when I read Mrs. Beery's email. After the article appeared, we had thousands of letters from individuals wondering if they had this treatable neurologic disorder. Most of them had unrelated neurologic conditions.
Dr. Fink examines Noah first.
In contrast to his twin sister, Noah had a brain MRI scan that showed there had been some areas of brain injury, common in children that have cerebral palsy. He had had significant motor delays, but he had overcome them with physical therapy.
It seems at this point that the cerebral palsy diagnosis is accurate, and the Beerys have come in vain. Then Dr. Fink turns to examine Alexis and finds something very different.
Alexis had a number of neurologic symptoms. She had impaired gait. She tended to walk on her toes. One of her feet was turned in. She had difficulty with her head control. The eureka moment came when I examined her arms. She's having a lot of difficulty using her hands, but it's not because of spasticity that I would attribute to cerebral palsy. This, plus the history of worsening, plus the history of diurnal variation, fluctuation in her symptoms during the day, it clicked. Maybe this is Sagawa's dystonia.
Sagawa's dystonia is often misdiagnosed as cerebral palsy, but isn't a form of brain damage at all. It is caused by a shortage of the chemical dopamine. Dopamine relays information between the neurons in the brain. Without it, the brain's signals to the muscles go haywire, making it impossible to control movement.
Sagawa's dystonia is very rare. Some estimates are at 1 in 2 million have Sagawa's dystonia. We think it's probably higher than that because we think there's a lot of undiagnosed individuals.
Sagawa's is so rare, there's still a lot the doctors don't know about its effects. The only way to determine whether or not Alexis has it is to give her a dose of a drug called L-Dopa and see if her symptoms go away.
When we administer the chemical L-Dopa, the body converts it into dopamine. An individual with very severe neurologic impairment gets dramatically better by giving this chemical.
The Beerys leave Dr. Fink's office with a dose of L-Dopa. Dr. Fink asks them to return the next day so he can see how Alexis reacts to the medication.
That night, we gave her the first dosage, and we went to bed. We woke up the next morning and realized Alexis slept through the night.
We gave Alexis a quarter of a pill after breakfast, and we go to the rental car, and Alexis at this point is walking with her hands down, and she gets into a car for the first time on her own with complete balance. She pulls her seatbelt down for the first time in her life. And Joe and I were in the front seat. We looked at each other and we had tears in our eyes.
The next day, the Beeries take Alexis back to Dr. Fink's office, where he examines her again.
Alexis had a very rapid improvement. Her ability to walk was dramatically improved within 24 hours. Her head control was much improved. Her ability to use her hands, her speaking was much improved within the next day.
Dr. Fink told us that it would be black or white, and when he saw her, he said, she definitely has Sagaw's dystonia.
Most physicians are not familiar with Sagaw's dystonia, and so they misdiagnose it as cerebral palsy. Not treated, Sagaw's dystonia can be disabling, and that disability can be extreme.
It's ironic, but it seems the twins have been battling different conditions all along. Now that Alexis has been accurately diagnosed and is getting treatment, the family heads back to Arizona, ready to begin a new life.
After Michigan, Alexis just was a different girl walking in the house. She was this moving, talking, walking little girl that we'd never seen before.
But as the months pass and Alexis gains control of her body, Noah suddenly starts to change.
Noah's right foot started to turn in, he started drooling, and his feet started crossing center.
The family jumps on a plane and heads back to Michigan to see Dr. Fink.
Noah began to show progressive neurologic impairment. He started tripping, stumbling, crossing his feet, turning his feet inward, and that progressive worsening indicated that this was not cerebral palsy alone. When I re-examined him, he had evidence of dystonia affecting his legs.
The brain damage on the MRI proves that Noah definitely has cerebral palsy, but it's possible he may also have Sagaw's. There's only one way to find out for sure.
We put Noah on the medication that Alexis is on, and he stopped throwing up. His foot straightened out, and he stopped drooling.
At that point, it was clear, since we'd already established that his sister had dope-responsive dystonia, that Noah did too.
There's no defined relationship between Sagaw's and vomiting, but like Alexis, as soon as Noah started treatment, his symptoms disappeared, including the vomiting. To stay healthy, the twins will take L-Dopa for the rest of their lives. And today, just 6 years after starting treatment, Noah and Alexis have made an astonishing recovery.
I think they have an excellent prognosis. I think that they will continue to have sustained benefit from taking this medication, L-Dopa, on a daily basis.
Noah and Alexis today look like typical kids. They are in a regular classroom. They're doing really great academically. They're involved in whatever sport that they want to do.
It truly was a miracle. We felt every day, and even today, feel like we see a miracle in front of us.
Noah and Alexis Beery's mysterious symptoms evolved over.
Diagnosis is a mystery.
Born Isabel Kalmalot deteriorates so quickly, her parents don't know if she'll survive her first week of life. On a Wednesday morning in December 2004, Brenda Kalmalot gives birth to a baby girl, who she and her husband Jake christen Isabel.
She was so beautiful. I was so glad to have her.
I didn't feel as scared as I thought I'd be.
She was just, just gorgeous.
But the next morning, Brenda notices something strange.
I was trying to breastfeed Isabel. She was a little sleepy, so I was having a hard time keeping her awake for the time they said I needed to be feeding her. 5 minutes is what she would do. They wanted her to feed for 20 minutes to half an hour.
And by the end of the day, Isabel starts looking a little yellow.
It just looked like there was yellow dye, just like she was playing in paint.
Doctors tell the Kalmalots it is jaundice, a very common condition in a newborn caused by elevated levels of a substance called bilirubin. It is easily remedied with exposure to sunlight.
We were under instructions to keep her under an open window in only a diaper to help her bilirubin levels go down.
But the next day, Isabel doesn't seem to be any less yellow.
On Saturday, we took her to the doctor's office because she was still a little jaundiced.
And something else has started to bother them.
She was very lethargic. She began sleeping more and more, and she would nurse for just a few minutes and fall back asleep.
They ended up poking a couple holes in her heel and milking blood out of it. Do blood tests to get a little vial full.
When the results come back, the doctor is confused. Isabel's bilirubin levels haven't decreased at all. In fact, they've gotten higher.
He sent us Sunday to go to the lab, and they took another blood test, and her bilirubin levels were even higher. And he called us after we had been home for about an hour from that and sent us to the hospital.
When the Kalmalots arrive at the hospital, Isabel is rushed into the intensive care unit. If the newborn's bilirubin levels are too high for too long, she could suffer brain damage.
They put her in an incubator and put these bright lights on her, these blue lights, and they put little sunglasses over her eyes to protect her eyes.
The blue lights provide a high dose of UV rays that should help break down the bilirubins.
They said nothing to worry about. Should be a few more days, you'll be able to take her home again.
Brenda and Jake are relieved that Isabel is finally getting the necessary treatment, but seeing their newborn in such distress is torture.
She spent all of her time, except for when I was feeding her, lying in the incubator. And she'd be crying, and we couldn't move her because we were trying to get the levels to drop.
And there were 2 holes in the side of the incubator that you could put your arms through. Brenda would be trying to just pat her through the holes in the side and soothe her that way.
Finally, after 2 days under the blue lights, she begins to get better, but not as quickly as the doctors were expecting.
When her billy levels began to drop, we were still hearing from the doctors, she should be responding more dramatically than this to treatment.
Then, on her 3rd day in the ICU, something terrifying happens.
One of the nurses came in to take her out of the room for a regular checkup. Her skin looked a funny color, kind of a greenish, grayish color. When they took her out of the room, I expected them to bring her back.
After 3 straight days in the hospital, Jake steps out for a break while Brenda waits for Isabel. Jake hasn't been gone for 10 minutes when a doctor comes back without Isabel and gives Brenda some devastating news.
She comes in and she said very bluntly, "We think Isabel is in heart failure."
If diagnosis is a mystery.
Brenda Kalmalot has just discovered that her week-old daughter Isabel, who has been suffering from extreme jaundice, may now be in heart failure.
I waited for the doctor to leave the room, and as soon as she was done, I burst into tears. It was the hardest thing I'd ever heard.
She called me and said, "Mom, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with Isabel."
She had a heart murmur, and in addition to the murmur, she was tired, not eating well, her skin color, it was mottled. She wasn't doing well. And they did an x-ray, and her heart was enlarged.
The hospital they're at is too small to handle such a serious problem. They'll have to transport Isabel immediately to a larger facility with a full pediatric ICU.
They gave her medication to cause her to remain unconscious. They hooked her up to IVs.
They were going to intubate her because the medication they were giving her sometimes caused children to stop breathing.
In the middle of all of this, Jake returns and can't believe what's happening.
I was gone for maybe a half hour. And when I get back, my daughter's in an incubator, and she's got paramedics around her. I see a tube down her throat, and it was breathing for her.
Isabel is quickly loaded into the ambulance, and her terrified family follows behind.
On the drive to the hospital, we were scared to death that the worst was happening. We felt powerless.
I thought she was a goner. I was going to lose her.
When we got to the pediatric intensive care unit, Isabel was just hooked up to all types of monitor machines, and they just instantly started running tests.
She was just a bundle of wires and tape and everything else. And the pediatric cardiologist actually came into Isabel's room and The first thing he said was, good news, she's not in heart failure.
The doctors tell the Kalmalats that Isabel has several small holes in the heart's wall, a condition known as ventricular septal defect.
He said, but this is not entirely uncommon, and it's not fatal necessarily. These kind of holes may heal themselves in the first 6 months to first year of her life, and if not, at 1 year old, she can have surgery to repair the heart.
When he told us she wasn't heart failure, it was just a big sigh of relief. You know, we breathed easy for about 5 minutes.
Then the doctors give them the bad news. For some reason, Isabel has gone into shock. A life-threatening condition in which the circulatory system is unable to provide adequate blood and oxygen to the body, causing the vital organs to shut down. Though shock is usually caused by infection, Isabel's tests are coming back free of any disease. The doctors now have to find out what is causing it before it's too late.
It was just a lot of sitting there waiting for results. She was intubated. She had a line in her neck and a line in her thigh. She was artificially paralyzed. She was sedated. They took blood for tests.
It was very, very difficult, and I know that it often is with babies. They have little veins. I know on one occasion they had to stick her over 30 times to get one IV line in her.
Her condition looked like it was deteriorating quickly.
If they can't get the shock under control quickly, Isabel could die. Pediatric internist Dr. Rama Pullela is assigned to the case.
Isabel was lying in the ICU bed, and she was very weak, and she was ashen gray, pale, and sick. There were two things that were really, really concerning. The first thing is when I shined light into her eyes, they weren't reacting at all. And that's a bad sign. That tells us that maybe there is something wrong in her brain. And the second thing was she was very lethargic. She wasn't responding like a normal baby. If you touch her or if you stimulate her, she wasn't responding at all. And that prompted me to get an emergent CT scan of her head.
And the scan reveals something surprising.
There was a bright spot in the CT scan on her head. In Isabel's case, the bright spot was so small that we thought in terms of calcification.
Brain calcifications in infants as young as Isabel can be caused by many different things, but aren't themselves dangerous. Ordinarily, a baby with calcifications would be observed over time to see if they increase in number or size. But in Isabel's case, time is the one thing they don't have.
For Isabel, I think making the diagnosis soon was the most critical point. Even hours matter in these patients.
They told us that Isabel had been made the top priority in the pediatric intensive care unit, and they had every doctor, every resident, every intern in the pediatric intensive care unit trying to figure out what was wrong with her.
Diagnosis is a mystery.
8-day-old Isabel Kalmalat is in the pediatric intensive care unit fighting for her life. What started as a mild case of jaundice has escalated into full-blown shock, and doctors have just discovered strange artifacts on a brain CT scan, the origin of which is a complete mystery.
When those results came back, they basically said, we want to do an MRI to follow up and see, because it's not certain and we don't want to worry you.
Then, while Isabel is being prepped for an MRI, another round of blood tests come back that seem to reveal a clue.
Isabel had a low steroid level called cortisol.
Cortisol is a hormone that helps combat illness and stress. When cortisol levels are too low, even the slightest disturbance can be too hard to handle, and the body will go into severe shock or even death. Dr. Pullela immediately orders a cortisol drip for Isabel, which should counteract the shock. But now they have a new mystery to contend with. Why isn't her body producing enough cortisol in the first place?
She wasn't making enough either hormones or enzymes that are necessary for her body. Her hypothalamus and pituitary glands secrete hormones, so we all knew that something was wrong with her brain.
When the MRI results finally come back the next day, the doctors are stunned to find that the bright spots on the brain that had originally appeared to be calcium deposits are actually holes where there's no brain at all.
Once we got the MRI, then everything started making sense that she doesn't have enough of hormone and her pupils are not reacting, so we knew that she was having septo-optic dysplasia.
Septo-optic dysplasia is a catch-all term for a variety of developmental defects of the brain. Isabel has 4 defects. She is missing the septum pellucidum and corpus callosum, structures that join the 2 sides of the brain. She has a small hypothalamus, the master gland that controls involuntary functions such as heart rate and temperature. And she has an underdeveloped pituitary gland, which controls the body's hormone output. Finally, Isabel's optic nerves are very weak.
I was scared.
I don't know how to describe the feeling that you're getting told all this stuff, and it just, I guess it kind of sets in.
The missing midline structures and weak optic nerves are impairing Isabel's vision, but it's the underdeveloped master glands that cause the biggest problems. Bilirubin and cortisol levels are controlled by the pituitary gland. Because Isabel's pituitary isn't functioning properly, her bilirubin levels rose, and her cortisol levels plummeted, sending her into shock.
It's a very rare disorder, and I've never myself seen a case. Nobody knows at this point what causes septo-optic dysplasia. There's a lot of research going on.
Though they won't know the full extent of the disorder until Isabel gets older, the doctors give the Kalmalots hope, assuring them that many of the symptoms are treatable.
Started walking us through it, and I was told that even though the center part of her brain was missing, she would still think, operate, and function like a normal child.
There are treatments for symptoms, for hormone deficiencies, for vision. They try and stimulate as much as possible.
Isabel is immediately started on hormone therapy to counteract the effects of her malfunctioning glands.
Isabel is basically right now getting growth hormone replacements because she lacks growth hormone. She gets cortisol replacements too.
Once she got those hormones and recovered in the hospital, she made a complete turnaround.
In retrospect, one thing is clear. Isabel's diagnosis was made just in the nick of time.
She was so close to death.
She could have died if she didn't have this diagnosis.
And now, just a year later, with rigorous hormone replacement therapy, Isabel is doing well. And the holes in her heart, which turned out to be unrelated to the septo-optic dysplasia, are healing themselves.
I think Isabel is actually doing amazingly well. She has some visual perception. She can appreciate light. She does try and say a few words. She does try and stand up with support. I think these are all good things.
Isabel is 2 years old now. She is thriving. She is an absolutely brilliant 2-year-old.
She sings, she plays, she's very independent, she gets around.
It's taught me a lot of strength going through this ordeal. She has more strength than I could ever imagine. Isabel just keeps me going.
While Isabel's problems started at birth, 43-year-old minister Charlie Harper had lived his whole life without any major health problems before being stricken with a terrifying symptom. In 1996, Charlie is an active community leader and bona fide workaholic.
As a senior pastor, my work weeks were endless, 80 to 100 hours a week.
Charlie's role in the community that he lived in was that he had to pick up the pieces for a lot of people's problems.
But it was extremely rewarding.
1997, however, is a difficult year as Charlie's work becomes more and more stressful. He seems to be getting more and more tired. Then, one day, something strange happens.
I began to experience starbursts or sparkles in my vision. They would look like a honeycomb of light, and then it would slowly dissipate. I had those flashes at least 2 or 3 times a month. I just thought that was just something normal when you were under a lot of stress.
At first, Charlie just tries to cope with occasional flashes in his eyes. But soon after, he notices another problem with his vision.
It became more difficult for me to read, and I was particularly noticing this in the pulpit. Number 1. More and more, I found my eyes glued to my text. My type size had gone up to 18, 20 points, enormous. And my congregation were getting a little worried when I would walk in with these stacks of paper that they were going to be in for a 4 to 5 hour lecture from the good Reverend, but it was just large type that I was compensating with.
Charlie assumes it's just a result of aging. He begins wearing reading glasses, which provide some help. Then, in July of 2005, Charlie and his wife pack up their 2 children and relocate to Arizona. But after only a few months, Charlie begins to experience a series of bizarre new eye problems.
I was playing tennis with my father, who's 82, and a good friend of his who was also in his 80s, and I was missing every other ball. I couldn't focus on it, and I would completely whiff it as if I had a hole in my racket. And the 2 octogenarians ended up winning the tennis match. I could not believe it. I said, well, I guess this is just not my game anymore.
Assuming he's simply getting too old to play, Charlie gives up tennis and takes up a new hobby in its place, painting.
My dad, he always loved art and loves to paint. He has a studio in the garage in his house in Arizona.
Charlie throws himself into his painting, but soon he finds that whatever is happening with his eyes is affecting him here as well. His daughter, Molly, is the first to notice.
One time she came into my studio and I was sharing my work with her, and it was a painting with very large strokes on it, and she said, well, this is great, but I'm wondering why you left this big white space here.
And I was like, did you mean to miss that spot? And he played it off as, oh God, I can't believe it. It's obvious, it's right there. How could I miss it? How could I miss it?
The incident shakes Charlie up enough that he decides to get his eyes checked. But at the routine exam, he makes a startling discovery.
She puts up the letters up on the light screen. And of course, the first letter is this huge, 1 foot by 1 foot letter E. And she covers my left eye, and I look at it. I can't see that letter at all. I was in shock.
Diagnosis is a mystery.
Charlie Harper has been having eye difficulties off and on for the past few years, but has always chalked them up to stress and aging. Now, an eye exam is showing that he can't see out of his right eye at all. Panicked, Charlie makes an appointment with an ophthalmologist, but after examining him, the doctor is stumped.
He didn't know what it was. I thought, oh, well, if he doesn't know, then it's just, something we can't do anything about. I'll be fine. I'm just going through a change in my eyesight, and everything will adjust and stabilize any minute now.
The doctor recommends that he see a retinal specialist, but Charlie does not take him up on the offer.
That worried me, but again, I did not have a sense of urgency about going to see anybody right away. I buried it. I was procrastinating.
Charlie returns home, figuring that he'll muddle through on his own. But with each passing day, he finds himself gradually shutting down.
I would isolate myself. I started becoming depressed and anxious.
He was in denial. I think at that point he was really suppressing his anxiety about what was going on here.
But then, one night while driving, Charlie's eye problems take a turn for the worse, and he realizes that his condition is becoming more than just an inconvenience.
Looking out through my windshield was often like looking through sunglasses smeared with Vaseline. What would have been a fairly clear and straight road, it was difficult to see beyond 100 feet of the front end of my car. It was a little scary. And try as he might,
Charlie can no longer keep his troubles hidden from his family.
There was just that one time where I was, bugging him. I was like, Dad, what are you, an old lady? Come on, let's go above the speed limit. He just turned to me. He said, no, I can't, because I really can't see.
Eventually, Charlie hits rock bottom when he realizes he can barely function on his own. He turns to his big sister for help and tells her everything that's been going on. Jessica is floored. She has been having vision problems of her own, and they seem eerily similar to Charlie's.
A little alarm went off in my head because I had been through almost exactly the same thing when I was having vision problems. I was on a tennis court, And I remember the lines on the tennis court becoming distorted, so I'd see 2 lines instead of 1.
Jessica tells Charlie that he could be suffering from a serious condition. She recommends that he come to Los Angeles to see the doctor who's been treating her vision problems, UCLA eye specialist Dr. Stephen Schwartz. The next day, Charlie is on a plane to LA.
Charlie came in with a story of progressive visual loss, having been attributed to stress and other things in his life, which is unfortunately all too common of a misdiagnosis.
Dr. Schwartz goes over Charlie's medical history and then begins a thorough examination of Charlie's eyes. What he finds is alarming.
Charlie had evidence of previous retinal bleeding that had resolved spontaneously. So there was a footprint of some damage that had been there, almost like a high water mark.
Retinal bleeding occurs when the small blood vessels behind the retina become inflamed and rupture, often obscuring a person's central vision. Retinal bleeding could be a sign of a serious condition, including irreversible deterioration of the retina. Schwartz immediately orders a series of tests for Charlie. Within an hour, he has the results.
He had 2 findings that were very worrying. First, he had a finding called peau d'orange. Rather than having a perfectly clear and typical retinal exam, he had patches in the retina that looked like orange skin. He also had abnormalities in one layer of the eye, just beneath or deep to the wallpaper, deep to the retina, that looked very much like cracks. We call those angioid streaks. These 2 findings point us in a very definitive diagnostic direction. The answer was right there.
Schwartz calls Charlie into his office.
So I sat down with Charlie and told him that he had PXE.
Pseudoxanthoma elasticum, PXE, is a genetic disorder in which elastic tissue throughout the body begins to harden. In the eyes, hardening of the highly elastic membrane behind the retina can lead to cracking. Small blood vessels take advantage of these cracks and grow through the membrane. Sometimes these blood vessels leak and bleed.
Everything that was going on with my eyes, the need for stronger and stronger reading glasses, the inability to hit a ball, all my driving difficulties were directly related to PXE.
When the retinal bleeding stops, scarring may occur. If the scarring occurs in a person's central vision, it can cause blindness. In Charlie's case, the bleeding stopped just prior to doing any major damage to his central vision.
So Charlie asked me, am I going blind? And I told him no. Because if we catch this early and we start to give you these new medicines, you have every chance of not suffering the same effects that you would have untreated.
For Charlie, it was the rarity of PXE that made diagnosis so elusive, as only 1 in 100,000 people worldwide are reported to have the condition. It is also genetic, and both Charlie and his sister Jessica have been diagnosed with the disease. The 2 work with PXE International, a research and support organization, in the hopes of raising awareness for the disease. Charlie undergoes regular testing to monitor and treat retinal bleeding. And while there is no cure for the damage that has already been done, Charlie and his family are learning to deal with his partially impaired vision.